All right, I'd like to go ahead and call this hearing to order here. First, let me welcome our distinguished witnesses and thank them for testifying here today. Our first witness will be a member, Congressman John Delaney, and we're certainly happy to have him with us today, and he will, as tradition dictates, he will testify, and then we'll start the regular panel of witnesses. This is the fourth event of the panel on public-private partnerships. We have investigated public-private partnerships case studies. We have looked at the role they play in our highway and transit systems, and we have investigated their emerging role in the delivery of water systems. And we have other hearings and roundtable discussions coming up in the next couple of months. We've had good discussions about the benefits public-private partnerships can provide, but we've also had frank discussions about the pitfalls and the challenges these complex arrangements can carry. The use of public-private partnerships in this country is fairly recent. Other countries have had a much more extensive history of partnering with the private sector to deliver infrastructure projects. In fact, one of the leading countries is just to the north of us. Over the last 2 decades, Canada has become one of the most advanced and active markets for public-private partnerships. To date, there have been more than 200 projects there that are operational, under construction, or in procurement. And that would translate population-wise to of course, something like 3,000 in this country. We will hear about the Canadian experience along with testimony on the global trends in public-private partnerships. This country can learn from other countries and their experience and how to identify projects well suited for a public-private partnership and how to invest arrangements that protect the public interest. In June, we are scheduled to go to the United Kingdom and hear some of their experiences. We've earlier met with some members from the Transport Committee of the British Parliament. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for being here, and I would now like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Capuano, for any statement he wishes to make.
Thank you all for coming. I'm looking forward to the testimony.
Thank you very much. We're always honored to have the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Schuster, and I'd like to call on him at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be just a little bit longer than Mr. Capuano, but I want to welcome our witnesses here. Welcome our good friend from Maryland, whose district borders mine, in Western Maryland, Western Pennsylvania. And he's had a lot of, just a freshman, but a lot of great ideas. We appreciate your thoughtfulness and appreciate you being here today, and I look forward to hearing from Canadian government, especially as we move forward on a surface bill, but also looking forward to the future of FAA reauthorization, looking to Canada and some of the great public-private things they've done up there across the board. And so, again, I thank everybody for being here and yield back.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. DeFazio.
That's fine, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Rice? Mr. Perry? All right. Well, not anybody long-winded this morning, so Mr. Delaney, you may proceed with your testimony. Thank you very much for coming to be with us.
Well, thank you for having me, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member and Chairman Schuster and the rest of my colleagues. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you today about a very important subject for the country, investing in our infrastructure and developing smart public-private partnership frameworks to do that. I have written testimony that I'd like to submit for the record. Thank you.
Yes, without objection, so ordered.
So, in my judgment, investing in our infrastructure should be our top domestic economic priority as a nation. And I say that for 3 reasons. First, investing in our infrastructure creates jobs, and it creates jobs that have a decent standard of living associated with them. Secondly, it's incredibly important for our competitiveness, particularly in a global and technology-enabled world where you need a competitive infrastructure to compete globally. And third, it's proven to be a good investment. The data suggests that for every dollar we spend on infrastructure, we get $1.92 of economic benefit. So in my opinion, by any measure, this should be our top domestic economic priority. And we face a very significant challenge as a nation as it relates to the quality of our infrastructure. But that challenge is also a very significant opportunity. The American Society for Civil Engineers estimates that we have about a $4 trillion hole or gap in our infrastructure investment. In other words, that's the amount of money we'd have to spend as a nation to bring our infrastructure up to world-class standards, which I think we all want to do if we want to compete in the world that we live in. But to fill that gap, in other words, to increase investment in infrastructure to that magnitude, you have to engage private capital against this challenge. Historically, infrastructure investment has been done by government, federal government, state government, local governments. But right now, at this moment in time, governments, most governments, are financially challenged. Yet at the same time, the private sector has more cash, almost $5 trillion of cash on its book, than it's ever had. So it seems to me very smart public policy involves engaging that private sector capital against this need, this challenge, this opportunity we have as a nation, this need and this challenge that has typically been filled by the public sector. And that's why the work you're doing around developing smart public-private partnership frameworks to meet this challenge is so important. And fortunately, there are bipartisan solutions to this challenge, one of which is something called the Partnership to Build America Act, which is a piece of legislation I introduced in the House about 10 months ago. Right now, the Partnership to Build America Act has 30 House Republicans and 30 House Democrats as co-sponsors of the legislation. In addition, about 2 months ago, it was introduced in the Senate, and there's a dozen senators, also bipartisan, that have co-sponsored the bill in the Senate. So as it stands today, the Partnership to Build America Act is the most significant piece of bipartisan legislation in the Congress dealing with infrastructure, and in my opinion, by definition, it is also the most significant piece of bipartisan economic legislation in the whole of the Congress. What the Partnership to Build America Act does is create a financing entity called the American Infrastructure Fund, which is designed to be a permanent financing enterprise that can provide loans and bond guarantees to states and local governments. And it's particularly focused just on states and local governments. It cannot be used by the federal government. It can finance all forms of infrastructure, all the food groups, if you will, transportation, energy, communications, water, and it'll exist for 50 years. It's capitalized up front with $50 billion of permanent capital that is put in the entity at its inception. So it's never subject to annual appropriations from Congress, and that capital will stay in the entity for 50 years. That capital can be levered 15 to 1. So in other words, it'll create a $750 billion revolving infrastructure bank bond guarantor to finance states and local governments for 50 years. We think that money can turn 2 to 3 times. In other words, it'll provide $2 trillion of infrastructure financing and create over 3 million jobs. But in addition to being large-scale and unique in terms of its financing capability, it's also unique in terms of how it's capitalized. The $50 billion is not put in by the federal government, but is put in by companies. And the way they do that is they buy 50-year, 1% non-government guaranteed bonds. And as an incentive to get the companies to buy these bonds, we say that for every dollar of these bonds a company buys, they can repatriate a certain amount of their overseas cash back to the United States tax-free. So what we're doing is we're tying into the huge amount of U.S. corporate cash that's sitting overseas. Almost half of U.S. corporate cash sits overseas. And we should be creating pathways for that money to come back as part of tax reform. But in the meantime, we're tapping into that money to capitalize this bank. So this strategy will create a $750 billion revolving infrastructure fund for 50 years without any taxpayer spending to capitalize it at the inception. And one of the reasons it's been so bipartisan, because it fuses together two concepts that each party has talked about for a long time. Democrats have talked about increasing our investment in infrastructure for 20 years, and we've been right about that. And my Republican colleagues have talked about creating paths for the overseas cash to come back to the United States so it can be invested in our economy, and they've been right about that. The Partnership to Build America fuses those ideas together to launch the American Infrastructure Fund. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me an opportunity to talk about the bill. I'd be happy to answer any questions to the extent members have those.
Well, thank you very much. by tradition and as a courtesy to our later witnesses, we don't ask questions of members since we have a chance to discuss these things with you at later times on the floor, and we know that you have many other things on your schedule. I will say that what you're talking about has great appeal to the members of this committee. Mr. Capuano, you want to say anything? Chairman Schuster, you want to say anything?
No, sir. I just appreciate Mr. Delaney being here again. We've sat a couple of times and spoken. He's a true believer in infrastructure, as I am, and members of this committee. And I appreciate all his hard work and effort. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right, we'll call up the first panel at this time. I understand that all the witnesses are here, so if they'll go ahead and take their seats at the witness table. Our first witness will be Dr. Larry Blain, who is chairman of the board of directors of an organization called Partnerships British Columbia. The second witness will be Mr. David Morley, vice president for business and government strategy of Infrastructure Ontario. The third witness is Mr. Cherian George, managing director of the Global Infrastructure and Project Finance of Fitch Ratings. And finally, our last witness will be Mr. Mehdi Simiateki, Associate Professor of Geography and Program and Planning at the University of Toronto. Of all the hearings that I have chaired and participated in, I don't believe, in fact, I know that I've never had one where we have 3 out of 4 witnesses being from Canada. This is extremely unusual, but we are pleased that all of you are here, and we know that with the experience that each of you have, that you can give us a lot of good information and knowledge about the subjects with which we are dealing. So thank you very much for being here, and Dr. Blain, you may begin your testimony.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. As Canadians, I can assure you we're not used to being invited to speak about our experience in Canada, so it's indeed a pleasure for us. I'd like to comment today on our experience with the delivery of performance-based infrastructure, and within that our particular experience in the province of British Columbia. In 2002, the Premier of BC announced the creation of an agency, Partnerships BC, and me, the CEO, to deliver a partnership program and to announce its first PPP project. This decision was essentially based on philosophic inclination and the experience in other countries demonstrating that the private sector could bring efficiencies and innovation to a major capital project, would take commercial risks that could be better managed by business rather than by government, while ownership of the asset can remain with the government as owner. The project was a hospital, and it was completed on time and on budget, and led to a value for money proposition when compared to traditional procurement. The users of the hospital, the clinicians, the patients, the visitors, rave about the progressive design and user-friendly atmosphere. Since 2002, the Canadian performance-based partnership market has evolved to becoming one of the most advanced and attractive in the world. To date, as the chairman mentioned, there have been more than 200 projects that are operational, under construction, and in procurement. Of the 10 Canadian provinces, 6 have agencies that are focused on PPP procurement, and local governments across the country are using performance-based procurement for major projects. The federal government formed PPP Canada. It's a Crown corporation that partially funds partnerships projects and also advises on the procurement of federal projects. It's a new institution. As governments moved into performance-based procurement, the private sector responded. International developers set up Canadian operations. Canadian developers expanded their capacity to do partnership business. Canadian construction companies became members of bidding consortia rather than contracting directly with government. Business and legal advisors developed expertise. The Canadian banks developed a capital market for loans and bond issues. Canadian pension funds and life insurance companies seeking long-term, high-quality investments added infrastructure to their asset allocations. Looking back over this period of development, the core benefits of PPP infrastructure procurement that have emerged in the minds of the politicians and the government leaders would be these: planning discipline and preparation. Many pitfalls are avoided before a shovel hits the ground because PPP requires more advanced planning. Certainty. Projects are on or under budget, on or ahead of schedule, and key risks are assumed by the private partners. These benefits are driven by financially motivated contracting. 3, life cycle asset management, a holistic approach to asset management over a 15, 20, 30-year period of time. 4, efficiencies and innovation. Competition and the profit motive can lead to startling results where the winning proposal provides solutions that the public owner never contemplated. This happens over and over again. It's also important to emphasize what partnerships are not, at least in Canada. A partnership does not need to be associated with a new source of revenue. We have PPP roads that are not toll roads. We have non-PPP roads that are tolled. And we have PPPs that are tolled but the public owner retains the risk, all variations. And to be absolutely clear, a performance-based infrastructure project is not a free project. The obligation of the owner to make performance payments over the life of the contract is on the government books. And finally, performance-based infrastructure works best and generates the most benefits as new greenfield projects and should not be confused with the privatization of existing assets. I'd like to wrap up with a summary of what governments can do to create a successful and attractive infrastructure market. These conclusions are based upon the Canadian experience, and I do not presume that they would apply in your context here. First, a policy framework driven by political commitment is critical. In Canada, at the federal level and in many provinces, including BC, the cornerstone of policy is the requirement that for projects over a certain amount, and in our case it's 50 million, a PPP approach has to be considered in the planning process. This provides a great deal of discipline across government. An interesting capital planning policy development within the United States that I'm aware of is taking place within the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange, which includes Oregon, California, and Washington, and also BC. Within the exchange, each jurisdiction is examining its capital planning policy, and Oregon, for example, has recently passed a law which now requires performance-based screen for the Department of Treasury for projects over 50 million. So in Canada, we don't have legislation to do this, but it's done by policy. Second, the 6 provinces in Canada that are undertaking partnerships projects and the federal government have created institutions that are focused on the planning and delivery of performance-based infrastructure. These organizations vary across the country, but what they have in common is that they provide services across government in all sectors, and they provide technical expertise and a memory of guidance and documentation. Each agency provides a single interface with the private sector and provides a consistent approach for that government across all sectors. They talk to each other, which serves to provide a degree of consistency and standardization across the country. Although I repeat, we do differ. The West Coast Exchange is contemplating an exciting approach to achieving the same end. It is proposing a certification process whereby projects in procurement can be certified by the exchange as following best practices, and this will provide great comfort to bidders in the market and thereby heighten the appeal for that market. Finally, the greater the flow of partnerships projects in a market, the greater the appeal of that market to bidders, as they can amortize the cost of entering and sustaining a presence in the market across a greater number of projects. Bidders typically do not limit themselves to a single sector, and therefore a market that has a multi-sector approach will be more appealing. BC has a population of approximately 4 million, and since 2002 there have been more than 40 performance-based projects amounting to more than $17 billion in total capital cost. Starting essentially with projects in the healthcare and transportation sectors, the range of projects has expanded to include rapid transit, sports center, an electric generating powerhouse, water and wastewater treatment plants, waste-to-energy plants, social housing, correctional facilities, a university campus, a workers' accommodation facility, an airport, and a high-security government building, all by the same organization. This approach gives BC much more attention in the market than would be warranted if the focus remained limited to just 1 or 2 sectors. I hope I didn't go over my 5 minutes. That completes my testimony. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Blain. Mr. Morley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm honored to appear before this committee. Infrastructure Ontario values the relationships that we are building with the United States, particularly as a member of the National Governors Association panel on public-private partnerships. On a personal note, working with American colleagues builds on my experience in the State Department's International Visitors Leadership Program. My goal today is to share information with you about Infrastructure Ontario's approach to public-private partnerships called alternative financing and procurement. To start, Ontario is home to about 13.5 million people, and the government is investing a total of $12 billion per year between 2013 and 2016 to renew public infrastructure. Infrastructure Ontario, or IO, is the Government of Ontario's agency responsible for delivering large and complex infrastructure projects. IO was created in legislation, is accountable to the government, and is led by a board of directors. While we work on behalf of the public interest, the majority of our board members and our employees have significant private sector experience. Using alternative financing and procurement, or AFP, IO has completed projects worth $6.5 billion in total construction value, has projects in construction worth $6.9 billion, and has projects in procurement worth $8.3 billion. These numbers translate into real investments in the largest public transit project in North America, a highway to the Canada-US border, 35 new public health care facilities, nearly 100 new courtrooms, close to 20 police detachments, and facilities for the 2015 Pan American Games. These projects are changing citizens' lives and their communities for the better. The AFP model is designed to deliver projects on time and on budget and in a manner that is consistent with the government's long-term infrastructure policy. To be clear, the core of this policy is protecting the public interest and maintaining control and ownership of public infrastructure. There are a number of ingredients for success in how we invest in public infrastructure with the private sector. First, risk transfer. Public payments during construction and long-term maintenance are conditional on performance. In the AFP model, the public sector establishes the desired project outcomes and transfers design, construction, and life cycle risk to the private sector. Second, value for money. Each of our AFP projects undergoes a rigorous third-party value for money assessment to determine if the AFP model offers better value than traditional procurement. IO does not use alternative financing and procurement unless value for money is positive. Value for money has translated into over $3 billion in savings to government. Third, standardized procurement processes and documents. Clients and bidders have come to understand our processes and rely on our template documents. Together, these shorten procurement timelines, manage bidding costs, streamline schedules, and promote competitive tension between bidders. Fourth, transparency. IO makes every effort to ensure transparency and maintain accountability while balancing commercial confidentiality. A third-party fairness monitor is part of every procurement to ensure the credibility of the process. As well, key documents like detailed project agreements and third-party value for money reports are published online. Fifth, market updates. Publishing a market update at least once per year has increased both market capacity and competitiveness. This encourages market participants to partner and plan resources in order to bid for and deliver projects. There is over $18 billion in our current pipeline of projects, which translates into over 18,000 jobs. The bottom line is always about high-quality results. A third-party study was done on our first 30 projects that reached substantial completion of construction. 29 of 30 projects were on budget, and 28 of 30 projects were delivered on time or within 3 months of the target date. The government likes the certainty. In closing, much of what we do at Infrastructure Ontario is consistent with what is presented in the World Economic Forum's 2014 Blueprint for Infrastructure Investment. Other studies by the Conference Board of Canada or the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships conclude that there are economic benefits from delivering projects using alternative financing and procurement. I hope that learning about Infrastructure Ontario and our ingredients for success contribute to your thinking about public-private partnerships in the United States. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. George.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. On behalf of Fitch Ratings,
You'll have to get a little bit closer to that microphone, I think, or are we sure it's on?
It wasn't on. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee. On behalf of Fitch Ratings, thank you for this opportunity to provide our views on the international experience with public-private partnerships. Fitch Ratings rates about 550 transactions on almost every continent, so we have a very broad and objective view in this space. While PPPs have been a tool used by governments to deliver needed public infrastructure for a long time, the track record has been mixed. Governments at first in the developed world, but increasingly in the developing world, have embraced the concept, and while problems have occurred, they have chosen to make changes and continue to pursue PPPs. Although there have been issues, this is not necessarily an indictment on PPPs, but instead a reflection of the fact that the complexity of the assets and services presents challenges in finding the right public policy balance that fits within a business, legal, and financial framework to bring best value to all parties, most importantly, citizens. While one can view PPPs as a glass half full or a glass half empty, it is Fitch's view that the former is the better perspective. They can provide public value, but need to be carefully crafted to address all stakeholder concerns. When they are viewed to have failed, the issue is often inappropriate transaction design and application. Responsibility for problems with PPPs can be assigned to both the public sector and the private sector. When issues of loss of control and too much profit arise, the responsibility lies squarely with the executive and legislative branches of the public sector that sets the rules. When issues rise from project cost overruns, delays in completion, higher operating costs, the responsibility lies and is absorbed largely by the private sector. In my view, success demands competence on both sides. A well-structured grantor team, public sector team, and a competent concessionaire are better positioned to respond and minimize the adverse effects to both parties. This is not always the case, and this unfortunately creates an asymmetrical risk. Grantors are exposed to government or political risk from unanticipated and unplanned obligations, which results in concessionaire delays and costs that may be further exacerbated with the possibility of being only partially compensated or not compensated at all. While risks abound, PPP structures have proven to be resilient. One must keep in mind that most risks can be anticipated and mitigated. Many projects have been implemented in many jurisdictions. While the market continues to face new pitfalls, governments and the market have learned from prior missteps. The issues that arise are not deal breakers, as sensible minds often prevail, with enough mutual benefit remaining for both parties to take the transaction to term. Learning from the mistakes of the past is a good way to begin avoiding new ones in the future. Let me briefly mention a few examples. Jarvis Concessions, a UK contractor, grew rapidly from a small contractor to Britain's largest engineering and construction firm. Problems in construction ensued. However, despite the severe stress, the projects were completed, and the impact on the public was largely from delays, not costs, as other contractors took over. 407, the electronic toll road in the outskirts of Toronto, was awarded a tariff regime with no caps on toll rates. The 99-year concession came under considerable criticism a few years after the inception of the transaction. Toll rates have gone up considerably, and there's little recourse for the province, as legal challenges were largely fruitless. The City of Chicago's concessions over the past decade for its Skyway toll bridge, municipal parking, and street parking were used to maximize upfront payments and subsidize city operational deficits with very liberal tariff regimes. These have come under considerable criticism. Here are some final thoughts. The challenge for government is transferring risk while maintaining flexibility. However, value can be garnered through advanced planning and meaningful public involvement. And yes, there are limits to PPPs. Some projects are too large or complex for private parties to absorb all the risk. Lastly, one must consider the likelihood that agreements may need to be renegotiated as time passes. The needs of the population and government will evolve, so it should not come as a surprise that key terms may be subject to debate and renegotiation, and possibly result in contract termination, with commensurate termination payments due from governments for value received. Mr. Chairman, Thank you for the opportunity to present my views. I'm happy to respond to any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. George. Dr. Semiateki.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege, and I want to thank you for pronouncing my name so well.
I'm not so sure that, but thank you.
You pronounced it the way I would pronounce it too, so thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you today to speak about public-private partnerships. I've been studying public-private partnerships in Canada and around the world for the past decade, and what I want to do today briefly is reflect on some of my experiences, some of the observations I've made, on both the strengths and the weaknesses, to reflect on what our colleagues have told us, and maybe give you some ideas of the issues that you should be concerned about as you proceed with developing your own public-private partnership approach. The first point to keep in mind is that public-private partnerships, at least in the Canadian model, are not a funding strategy. These are not, for the most part, bringing in new money to deliver infrastructure. This is a financing strategy. The private sector finances the infrastructure up front, but most of these facilities do not have a user charge or a revenue stream that can directly repay the private money. The money for these projects is coming, for the most part, directly from the taxpayers and the general revenue stream. So to think that public-private partnerships are going to fund new infrastructure has not generally been the experience in Canada, and I think that's important to keep in mind. The second point is around which types of risks are being transferred. The governments in Canada have primarily focused on construction risk, so that's the potential for costs to overrun and for projects to be delayed. Those are the main risks that are being transferred. Availability risk over long-term concessions has been another aspect that's been focused on. But again, we're not transferring demand risk or revenue risk, the likelihood that a project doesn't meet its expectations in terms of the revenues that come in for these facilities. So this, again, is another aspect of the Canadian model. I think the real strength of the Canadian model is in setting up institutions that have the skills to negotiate and structure deals alongside the private sector partners. We have very highly skilled organizations, Partnerships BC and Infrastructure Ontario being amongst them, who have in-house skills, who are able to negotiate. And keep in mind that when on the public sector side, it's important that you have these skills. The public-private partnerships in Canada have not been a way of getting government out of delivering public infrastructure. So what public-private partnerships, as you've heard already, are really about is value for money. And value for money, as Dr. Blain mentioned, is driven by innovation, is driven by performance contracts, and is driven by risk transfer. And if we really think about it, it's risk transfer, and primarily construction risk, and certainty that projects are not going to balloon in cost, as has been the typical experience, and are not going to be delayed for years and years, which has also been the typical experience. Let me highlight now some of the challenges that my research has found to give you a sense of what some of the issues are that are out there in the Canadian marketplace. The first is around the cost of public-private partnerships. This is not a cheap way to deliver infrastructure. Public-private partnerships have higher construction costs, they have higher financing costs, they have higher transaction costs, and they have a risk premium that the private sector will build into their bids if they're going to take on those risks. So the only way you justify these is by the risks and the value of transferring risk from the public to the private sector. That's coming directly from a study that I conducted looking at the government documents that review these types of studies, that review these types of projects. Risk is the key driver, and the question then is how much are you willing to pay for that certainty? It's like buying an insurance premium. It's like buying a policy, and you have to know that the premium is worth what you're going to be getting to control that type of risk. So that's a major issue to keep in mind. We can think of some of the other issues that have come up around community engagement. There's a high level of confidentiality and commercial sensitivity in these deals that we have to be aware of, and how your publics, how your constituencies, stakeholders engage in that project planning can be challenged if all of the information that you would need to make a decision is not in the public realm when it's needed. Innovation. What types of innovation? Are these for the public benefit? How is the public capturing the value of those innovations, both financially and socially? Loss of flexibility. You have contracts that can last anywhere from 25 to 50, 99 years. Things change over that period. You have the issue of lock-ins and the potential that you will not have the flexibility to make changes, whether it's to user fees, whether it's to changing the structure of your facility, whether it's to renovating. If you have a contract that locks you in and creates a lot of doesn't give you the flexibility to change that over time. Another issue is around the firms who are engaged in this. Public-private partnerships are large bundled contracts, and there can be challenges about whether local firms are really able to engage in this at the high level to be able to deliver those projects. We've heard concerns about this. We're starting to try to do studies to really tease out whether that's an issue to be concerned about. And the last one I would mention is whether public-private partnerships are the only game in town. Public-private partnerships have the capacity to deliver value when they're appropriately structured and when they're used for the right types of assets at the right times. We want to be creating institutions and organizations that have the flexibility to, on the one hand, choose public-private partnerships when they're appropriate, and on the other hand, say traditional build and traditional approaches would be the best approach for this type of project. And so you really want to avoid creating institutions that have the incentive that are only structured to deliver public-private partnerships. You want to create situations where all of the different types of procurement models are open and are being evaluated at the time, and each of them can be chosen equally. So those are my comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. Thank you very much. All of you have been very helpful. My practice is always to go last so I can get our members involved in it before they have to leave, and I'll go first to Mr. Barletta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Blain and Dr. Morley, this morning Mr. Delaney discussed the benefits of infrastructure banks. As my understanding that the Canadians are also considering the benefits of an infrastructure bank. Can you tell me what you see as the strengths and weaknesses of the banks? And additionally, how do we as policymakers prevent infrastructure banks from being bogged down in bureaucracy, making them unable to rapidly issue loans?
The system in Canada is that the federal government supports provincial and local government projects through grants, and these are available under a variety of programs. All of the Canadian provinces have very high credit ratings. British Columbia is AAA. They all have access to capital. So I don't see the need for an infrastructure bank because the idea of a public-private partnership is that you optimize the combination of the public contribution up front, grants or otherwise, and the private sector capital. And therefore, there's no problem accessing capital. If there's a market breakdown of some kind, if you have no access to capital, then I can see the need for different kinds of infrastructure banks that would fund that. But in Canada, there is no need for such an organization, in my opinion.
Thank you very much for the question. I think there are a range of tools that can be used to fund and finance infrastructure. As my colleague said, the federal government has initiated Public-Private Partnerships Canada, which is doing two things. One is it's investing in grants to public-private partnership projects in cooperation with other levels of government. The secondly is it's investing in its own federal projects using a P3 model. So they're helpful partners to us, but the provinces have really taken a leadership role here. In the case of Infrastructure Ontario, we have definitely charged ahead with a strong program around alternative financing and procurement. And the key thing is that we have the expertise to translate the public interest into private sector terms. It levels the playing field in terms of the negotiations, the procurement processes, and the contracts that are put in place. That's very important. I'd like to expand. Infrastructure Ontario is not only the lead agency for alternative finance and procurement. We also have a loan program, and that is for infrastructure projects, largely for smaller communities that have smaller projects where they may not have the opportunity to participate in alternative financing and procurement. And so I think we have to look at the suite of tools that are available to structure the best investments in public infrastructure projects. And for Infrastructure Ontario, we use both alternative financing and procurement as well as loans.
Thank you. To all, and maybe we can go backwards, starting with Dr. S. One of my concerns is that public-private partnerships need to be structured in a way that allows local subcontractors to get a chance to participate in the project. Do any of you have best practices regarding the role of small businesses in these big P3 projects?
Thanks for the question. This is certainly an issue that's come up in the Canadian context in Ontario. There's been a lot of concern about which firms and whether they're local firms, how they become engaged. One of the things that can be done is you can write that into the bidding documents that local firms have to be used at various stages and at various scales of the enterprise and of the concession team. The challenge is that as you write those in, the concessionaire will price that. So they'll price that into their bid, and especially if there's additional risk, if you have smaller consortiums and smaller firms that may not be as skilled, that will end up being in the price of the project. So the issue of local contractors is really one that's finding that balance between getting those folks involved, making sure that the bundles aren't too big that local firms or even regional firms can participate in. We're seeing projects now where the bundle of services in there can be upwards of $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion. Many of these projects are simply too large for the small and medium-sized firms to be engaged in, and even in some case, some Canadian firms, and we're seeing many international firms coming in. So this is becoming the terrain in which debates around public-private partnerships and who's engaged in them are taking place. I should just add, there needs to be ongoing research on this. This issue has bubbled up recently, and there's still a need for research to really understand who is working on these jobs, how local are they, and what really is defined as local. Many international firms are now setting up offices in Ontario. So do you consider that local? There's all sorts of different dimensions, and also tracking which workers are engaged. Are they international workers, or are they local as well? So this issue of the workforce is one that I think is now come to the fore and needs more research to really get a handle on.
Thank you. My time is up. Maybe I'll come back in the second round. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Mr. Capiano.
Mr. Chairman, I think I'm going to follow your lead and pass on to my colleagues.
All right. Mr. DeFazio.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm really trying to. So the federal government provides funding, and then the provinces engage. And then we have this study which shows that we're assuming a huge risk premium, which means you have some history of really bad contracting in Canada where the public totally failed through design-build contracts to deliver projects on time. Is that the case? What problem are you solving here? Our problem is we don't have the money, and we don't have the guts to raise the money. Our problem isn't necessarily contracting. It certainly is in certain cases, like procurement of IT. We can look at that with the recent rollout of the ACA, or we can look at the Pentagon, or we can look at the FAA. We got lots of bad contracting, but how are you improving on a good design-build contract which has penalties if something isn't delivered on time, incentives if it is delivered ahead of time, and you've got an innovative design and innovative delivery, and it would be apparently substantially cheaper from the analysis we have from Dr. and I didn't get the pronunciation. Semyateki? Okay. I mean,
Semyateki.
She has a challenged name too, so I think you're related. Could someone answer that? I mean, why don't you guys answer that first? What's here?
I've been in this business since 2002, and I've been looking since 2002 to find some statement of evidence about the performance of traditional procurement. You won't find it. At least I haven't been able to find it. I don't.
But how is this different than a design build?
I'm just saying that you can't point to a lot of evidence in British Columbia or elsewhere in Canada or anywhere else in the world where traditional procurement is really evaluated in terms of what were the cost overruns, were they on time, et cetera. So we don't have that as a.
Well, then how do you come up with the 49%? I mean, so you're paying substantially more, but you don't have a body of evidence that the previous system didn't work.
We do a line-by-line analysis of the project, and we look at all the consequences. If this project is 2 months late, what would the consequences of that be? What would the cost implications of that be?
Right, but in a design build, you can say the consequences of being 2 months late is $500,000 a day.
Yep. Design build has better results than traditional procurement, DBB type procurement, and DBFM, design build finance maintain, is just another step along the spectrum. But there are benefits, exactly as you allude to, from doing design build contracting in comparison to DBB contracting.
Right.
So it's just one is even better to lock it in on a 30-year basis.
Yeah, what I'm struggling with here is we had, a PPP panel a few weeks ago. We're mostly talking about water. And, I said, okay, what percent of United States of America's infrastructure problems could you optimistically resolve? Because they are dependent upon a cash flow. We're not going to toll every bridge in America. We're not going to toll, all of our interstate system. You're not introducing in most places new tolling because you're getting the money from the federal government. So what you're saying is you're getting a more efficient construction method. So, I guess that's the bottom line here, is a more efficient and innovative. Yes, Mr. Morley.
If I could add that there are a number of things that we feel are very beneficial with the alternative financing and procurement approach. First off, there's much more rigorous budgeting at the front end of the project. So when we engage with a public sector client, there is an extreme amount of due diligence around the budgeting. We see a benefit in
right, but
that.
We're now back to contracting.
Right.
And so would you say that if you had a good design build contract, that you are delivering more value here to justify the much higher cost, up to 49%?
So if I can take you through a little bit more.
No, you don't have time. You're going to have to distill it down.
I think the other thing that's really important here, and you'll see it in the third-party study that we did on our first 30 projects, is that there's much more control over scope changes during projects. And we have...
Right. Now we're back to crappy government contracting practices. Okay, we got that. But I'm just trying to say, if we had a good design build, and sometimes my Department of Transportation in Oregon does a good job with design build with penalties and incentives, and things work out great. Sometimes they've got a huge disaster ongoing in the coastal hills where they interfered and mandated a design that didn't work. So we're really back to, it's just saying if we put it out to the private sector and say, get this done, do you want to pay that much premium, or just say, here it is, you bid on it, get it done? And we're not, I don't quite get it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I've got an example for you that might help. We just concluded a 30-year power generating project. So that was done at the DBFM. So the concessionaire has to hang in and look after that asset. It has to work for 30 years.
Right.
If we just did a DB, he walks away when it's done and there's no warranty.
Right. Well, you can have a design, build, operate, maintain too.
Well, but that's a PPP.
Right.
Can I add one note?
Yes.
Of the Ontario projects, not all of them are design, build, finance, operate, maintain. In my sample of 28 projects, 19 of them were build, finance, design, build, finance. And so if we're hearing that most of those or all of those are built on time and on budget, that's a good sign that that initial part, the part of the project that public-private partnerships, at least in Ontario, are really focusing on is the construction risk. And you might not need the 30-year financing period where the cost of finance really goes up quite substantially. If the aim is to get that construction on time and on budget, you might be able to do it through either design build or include some amount of private finance, keeping in mind that that money is all going to be, or most of it is going to be paid back through direct government sources anyway.
Mr. Chairman, if you'd indulge, one more. Dr. Blain, where did the money come from for the dam?
It was financed 60% by the concessionaire and 40% by grants from the utility.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rice.
To continue along the same line of question, and I'll put this out there to all of you. To get involved in this, private company is going to want to make a profit. Otherwise, they're not going to get involved in it. So what level of profit do they look for, number one? And number two, is that offset by efficiencies that the private company brings to the table? Because if it's not, it's got to cost more. So that's my question. What level of profit do the private companies look for? And two, is it offset by the efficiency? I'll start with you, Dr. Blain.
Most projects, the private capital tends to be highly levered, so it's, say, 90% debt, 10% equity, and the equity portion returns are in the order of 11, 12% over the length of the contract, in that order of magnitude. And the value for money analysis that we do compares the PPP with a traditional procurement, and we tend to average between 5 and 10% net present cost benefit of the PPP over the traditional procurement that's estimated over the life of the contract, say 30 years.
So you're saying the profit cost is 11% and the efficiency is, what'd you say, 5 or 6%? So there's an additional 5% cost?
The
Do I have that backwards?
No, I think you've got it right. It's the return that the concessionaire expects when he enters into the contract. If everything goes well, he will earn 12%. If he doesn't perform, he will earn less than 12%. When we then estimate the value for money of that contract from the owner's point of view, the government, that we compare the PPP to a traditional procurement, take the present value of the whole lifetime contract expenditures, and in British Columbia, our analysis, we tend to average a 5 to 10% savings.
Okay, that 5 to 10% savings takes into account the profit of the private entity. Yes. You agree with that, Mr. Morley?
Yes. So when we start a project, there is a set budget that includes all costs, and we do financial analysis on that. And then through the procurement process, we do the value for money assessment at 3 different stages. We also tailor the value for money assessment to particular sectors and then to each specific project. So the rigor on the value for money is important. The rate of return for the private sector partners is part of that overall budget.
And what do you find that rate of return? What do you find that rate of return to typically be?
I think my colleague has kind of given you a range that is probably the market trend. But the reality is, including that.
So the market trend you think is 11 or 12%?
We've definitely seen some that are lower than that. The other aspect that I think is important here is that through the competitive bidding process, we're increasing from having 5 bidders on our projects to having 10 bidders on our projects.
Okay, so just to cut to the chase, because I don't have a lot of time, even taking into account the 10 to 12% or sometimes lower profit that the private company makes, it still costs less doing it with a public-private partnership.
Can I add something?
Our evidence is that value for money is positive, even when you consider all costs.
Mr. George, what level of profit does a private company require in your experience?
For availability-based projects, I would say it's in the range of 10 to 12% because a lot of the risk is just mainly construction and operations. For demand-based projects, it's much higher because they take traffic risk. I take a slight...
Say it again.
For demand-based projects, so a road like the Beltway Managed Lane project or the Chicago Skyway, et cetera, the risk is greater.
Where it's contingent on demand.
And there's demand risk.
So they're taking more risk. So what profit are they looking to make there?
It's higher. It's probably in the high teens.
High teens?
Yeah.
Okay.
So let me offer
taking that profit into account,
yeah.
Is it still cheaper, all things considered, in the long run, for the government to do it through a public-private partnership or not?
I think if you can tell from this conversation, it's difficult to tell. But let me offer you a different perspective. We have projects today that are run by government that are not maintained. And rather than maintain them and spend less because we don't have the money, we actually rebuild them because we did not do the maintenance. The cost associated with that is not being factored into any of these conversations. The thought I would offer is that we have public sector entities, DOT, some do a very good job, some don't do as good a job. We have public authorities, same thing. We have PPPs. We have some of the same issues. What it does is it puts them in competition with each other. You think about entities like Florida that are doing PPPs. They are doing the traditional delivery and they're doing the PPP. They now have discipline that's been established in the PPP that they can now infuse in the DOT.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have to cut you off. Finally, you, sir. I'm past my time, so can you give me a quick answer?
Very quickly. If you look at the value for money reports, and I have a quick summary of a few of them in my testimony, what you see is that the base costs are invariably higher for PPPs. That's the cost of construction, the cost of operations, the cost of financing are invariably higher for the public-private partnership than traditional build. You also see that transaction costs are typically higher for public-private partnerships, and you see that the financing costs are higher. So to say that this is a cheaper way of delivering infrastructure is not accurate. It's after the risk. It's that you're controlling the likelihood or the potential of cost overruns or costs coming back to government. That's where public-private partnerships potentially see their benefit. And I think that's really what we're debating, not whether they're cheaper or more expensive. The evidence produced by the government shows they're more expensive to deliver and they're more expensive to build.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. Mr. Larson is next on the Minority side.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Blain, I've got a meeting with you this afternoon, so I'll let you off the hook for a little bit until the end of my 5 minutes, perhaps. But, yeah, Dr. S., the last point you made, is it encapsulated by saying that just objectively it may cost more, but the project gets done? Is that the trade-off that you're finding in the experience looking at the projects you've looked at?
So the saying, if it costs more, but it gets done. Yeah, and I think there's both a planning and a government rationale to that, and also a political rationale. I went out and did interviews with politicians. They hate when projects go up in budget. You have to go back to your taxpayers and back to your constituents and ask for more money. So there is a certainty. There's a benefit to certainty for government from a budgeting perspective. You know how much it's going to cost, even if it's a bit more upfront or even quite a bit more upfront. You know how much that's going to cost. But there's also a political benefit to public-private partnerships, and that's been one of the motivations for using these as well.
Yeah. I have to add just one comment, if you don't mind.
Didn't I tell you that you have a meeting at 3 o'clock with me?
I know.
Answer. So I control the time, so I get to ask questions. Mr. Morley, are you finding in Infrastructure Ontario that certain projects are better for PPP and other kinds are not?
So we've done the assessment of our first 30 projects, and they range across sectors: hospitals, courthouses, detention centers, and we found that those are extremely effective. They take on different models. Some are design, build, finance, maintain, and some are design, build, finance. We found them to be very effective. In the rare cases where they have been late, the majority of that risk and the responsibility and the cost associated with that has been the responsibility of the private sector. So that's good news for the public sector. The other thing is that there's confidence in the case of a design, build, finance, maintain project where the asset will be maintained over the life, over 30 years, and that is important because it encapsulates life cycle cost. In those cases of hospitals, to address the question about local partnership, in fact, many of the employees maintain their employment with the hospital and have long-term employment in that contract. We also do a significant amount of work to engage local companies, and so we find that there are definitely benefits to using the FP model.
Yeah. Mr. George, could you comment on that from Fitch Ratings experience? Sure. Are there certain kinds of projects that work better than not?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key is that you're able to define scope and that you have an objective way in which you can measure performance.
Does that apply whether it's a hospital or a road or
it does. I mean, what we're talking about is infrastructure, which is easier to assess. But if you're looking at providing qualitative services like, in a prison or, like security services and, clothing and things like that, it becomes much more qualitative, and then there's more area for disputes between parties, and that's when it could break down.
Yeah, okay. Dr. Blain.
I just wanted to add a comment about the cost of construction. We typically assume 5 to 10% savings comparing the construction cost between a DBB and a design build, just from the integration of design with the building and the efficiencies of the private sector. So I would disagree with Maddie a little bit on that one, because our empirical evidence is that it is cheaper, and also the maintenance, long-term maintenance, tends to be cheaper than if the public sector does it.
But is that comparing one type of, that's comparing just DB to?
Just the construction side, yes.
Just construction side?
Yes.
Okay, all right. In British Columbia, though, Dr. Blain, is there, you ran off a list of hospitals.
Yep.
And then I read online, you're trying to build a jail in the Okanagan.
Correctional facility.
Correctional facility. So you're trying to build this jail in the Okanagan, and there's delay, and there's a delay in getting financing for it. Is there just some issue? Are there some issues that you're finding in British Columbia, where it's easier to do a certain kind of project versus a different kind of project?
There's no issues that I can think of where we haven't attracted the financing, so I'm not sure what you're referring to there. But typically, the kind of project that lends itself best to a PPP is a big project with lots of risk. The more risk is in it, the more engineering challenges, the scope for innovation, those are where you get the benefits, and therefore those are the kinds of projects. As the projects get smaller, there's a lot of overhead in doing a PPP, and the benefits are more difficult to achieve. The bigger the project, the hairier it is, the more the scope to get the benefits.
And just finally, doesn't that sort of support Dr. S's point about a lot of the success is in being able to transfer risk?
Yes, transfer risk and innovation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. I guess I'll start with Dr. Blain, and I'll see you a little bit later as well. But I'm wondering, anything other than the profit that's been talked about here a little bit that drives the cost higher for the P3? And I think you kind of went through it a little bit, but I just want to codify it and repeat it if necessary as many times for us to get it. Anything other than the profit?
There's more upfront planning, to be sure. Much more thoughtfulness goes in, much more rigor. So the budget to get a PPP ready to go to the market is higher than if government does a traditional procurement. And I think it's money really well spent, but it is more expensive.
So then when you do the upfront planning, because that saves money down the line on the construction, et cetera, or maybe just a plain long-term operation of the concession, if it is one, are there any other efficiencies? Because you're building the same, once you do the design of the thing and the financing, the construction, whether it's the government or whether it's the private sector, is that generally the same, or are there significant differences that we need to know about?
For each particular risk that you're transferring to the private sector, some of the risks, the concessionaire will just build that into their return on equity, and which is higher than the government's borrowing cost. Other risks, they'll actually price into their bid. They'll say, if we're going to take that risk, we're going to add this much to the actual bid price. And so the cost of that insurance, if you will, it does make is added on above what the traditional budget would have in it. But it is insurance.
Mr. Morley, can you talk to any of those risks and any differences that there might be? And I'm looking in terms of maybe, in America and in the state that I come from, we talk a lot about project labor agreements. We talk about the federal wage requirements and some of those inefficiencies. Are you bound by all or any of that? Is it a first dollar situation, or is it if it's a P3 where 50% of the funding comes from the private sector, then, or 50% or more, then you're not bond? Is there anything that we need to know that we can include in our efficiencies or concerns here in that regard?
Thank you very much. There's a range of things in the budgeting process, in the definition of outcomes and output specifications for a project, in the analysis of the risk matrices for value for money, where we drive into the details of each of the risks. And so the types of things that are really important: environmental risk, change in government policy risk. There's significant due diligence with third-party experts, technical advisors, and financial advisors on projects. Those are all very important. We translate those risks that are in the value for money into our project agreement. And so that's the binding mechanism to ensure that the rights of the government and the public interest are preserved, and that there are mechanisms, whether it's in construction or through the maintenance period, when we talk about performance-based, that the government can exercise those rights to ensure that if the risk is not being transferred or addressed adequately, or if the project is being delayed, that risk remains with the private sector. So it provides more of a certainty and guarantee and confidence to the public sector.
So from my standpoint, where I disagree with the one gentleman down the line here, it's not that we don't have the guts to do what needs to be done here. We're not getting the value for whatever the fee increases or the policy changes that drive fee increases or fares, whatever would be associated with. There's not the value there. If the value were there, I think the people, the citizens, would be much more apt to support it. As policymakers, how do we mitigate? And do you have a specific set of risks that, well, you already do. You already talked about them, but policies to address those risks that are available where you come from that aren't available here.
Absolutely. So there's, I was happy to see a representative from Maryland here through our work with the National Governors Association. We are collaborating with different states, and we are taking them through our methodology in terms of budgeting, output specifications for projects, specific details of our value for money. We'd invite you to come to Canada, to come to Ontario to work with us. We'd be happy to transfer some of that knowledge to you, because every project goes through this disciplined process, and that's what gives our board of directors confidence to approve it, and it's what gives the government confidence to invest in it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield.
Thank you very much. Mr. Maloney.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you for your testimony. I was curious about this issue, Dr. S., that you said in your testimony about the risk premium and how that factors into the colloquy you're having about whether the value for money analysis makes any sense. I mean, so my colleague's questions around whether, which I share, Congressman Rice's concern about, at the end of the day, is this better or not, which of course was the subject of your study. Can you explain the risk premium factor? Because that sort of tilts the scale pretty significantly, doesn't it, sir? I mean, I understand your colleagues at the other end of the table would assert that the value for money analysis is better in every case, and yet your testimony seems to suggest it's not, unless you had the risk premium, and then of course the size of that risk premium either makes it more or less expensive. So, can you illuminate us on that subject a little bit?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I mean, we went out doing this study to try to understand what underpins the value of public-private partnerships. We added up the cost of construction, we added up the transaction cost, we added up the cost of financing where it was available. And as the documents show, in each case, those are less for traditional build than for public-private partnerships. It's only after you consider this issue of risk. And risk, I think we need to be really clear about what risk is. Risk is it's costs that will come back to government if something happens. So it's the cost of cost overruns, it's the cost of change orders. If you have a long-term operating period, it's the cost of the facility not being available. Sure,
and I'm sure you don't deny that risk is a real thing.
Very real.
Neither would any of us. The question is, what is the magnitude of that risk, and how do you calculate it, and is it being done properly? And what's your conclusion there?
So in my study, we asked for the risk matrices and for all the documents behind that so we could check. It's called a risk register, where they'll create they'll look at all of the projects that have been done in the past to try to see what actual risks happened in the past. We asked for that documentation and weren't given it as academics. So I write that in the paper. That leads us, we couldn't validate whether the risk premium was appropriate or not. We know that traditional build projects have cost overruns that are quite large, but we're not sure if the average overrun or the average additional cost to government would be 49% or less. There's some studies from the Auditor General that suggest that it might be less than that, but there are also experiences where there's more. So we couldn't find that evidence, and we wrote that in the paper as academics.
And I saw that. But is it also fair to say that you also didn't take into account the risk of doing nothing, right, or the costs associated with doing nothing? In other words, one of the things that we struggle with, right, is, and my colleague from Massachusetts who's not here today has expressed this several times, is there is a risk that things just don't get done. And there are costs associated with not doing them, and there's all sorts of ancillary and nonlinear economic activity that's lost because we just dither instead of doing something. That's not factored in, however, to that risk premium, right?
Well,
there's no opportunity cost factored into.
No, and if you keep in mind the way that public-private partnerships are working in Canada, they're not replacing private money. This isn't new money. So the projects
I want to talk about that, but yeah.
The projects, like, if you take at their word that this is a study between the public-private partnership and the traditional. If the traditional looks better, they could have built the traditional. They have the skills. They could have gone out with the procurement. They have the money together. So our alternative.
That's the difference between Canada and the United States. But yeah, but it is right. I mean, we're often in the world of if not this, nothing. As you point out, this is not a substitute for traditional. This is not a solution to find new funding in Canada. Here it is very often, and so it's more relevant here, it seems to me. But in the remaining minute I have, I just want to give your colleagues an opportunity to talk about this risk premium issue. I take it you have a different view of this.
Actually, I don't really disagree. I just think that when you incorporate the risk premium and we calculate it accurately, best we can, you end up with value for money. and you end up.
Who has custody of the information that Dr. S has been unable to obtain?
Well, he didn't ask us for it, but
so you'd be happy to disclose that?
No, we wouldn't, because when you give out the risk matrix to the bidders, you're revealing your personality. You're revealing your risk aversion. You're revealing how much you value every risk.
Well, in a particular project, sure, but in the aggregate, you could anonymize it across multiple bidders.
That we give out.
I mean, sure, if you're in the context of a bid, I appreciate that. But in the context of 28 projects that are backward-looking, and if everybody does it and it's anonymized, what's the harm?
We've given out risk matrices that are sort of made more like non-specific to a specific project, more like average-type estimates. That's easy, but for a specific project, no, because it's commercially sensitive.
Fair enough, but you would agree that we should have that information to get a true assessment of whether the risk premium makes any sense or not.
I'll give it to you.
Well, my time's expired, so we'll leave it there. Thanks.
All right. Well, I'm curious about this, Mr. Morley and Dr. Blain. Dr. Semioteki says that these projects, his testimony says 16% more than a comparable project would cost using conventional tendered contracts. This is mainly because private borrowers typically have higher financing costs than governments. Transaction costs for lawyers, consultants, management costs, and project monitoring also add 2.2 to 5% to the final cost, and the private sector concessionaire charges a premium on facility construction, so forth and so on. And he says the main factor that's not really figured in is the risk or the advantage. Yet, Mr. Morley, you say in your testimony the Ontario government, through Infrastructure Ontario, is delivering over 80 projects using the AFP model, valued at about $35 billion, and with an estimated $3 billion in value for money savings. What do you say to Dr. Semioteki?
So he's a friend from Toronto, and we've definitely had lots of good dialogue with him. And in fact, to speak to value for money, based on 8 years of work, we are currently doing a refresh of our value for money because we've learned some things and will continue to improve that. Bottom line, though, is when a budget is set and we compare a traditional project with an alternative financing and procurement project, we have found positive value for money. We only get approval from our board of directors to proceed with a project when there is positive value for money. To give further credibility to our risk process, there are a number of steps that we take. There's an identification of the risks. There's workshops with the client group to ensure that we understand what the outcomes of the project should be and what risks that will result in, and how do we transfer those risks appropriately. Our models have been done by external advisors and also validated by internal auditors within the government. And so there's a significant amount of discipline about that. We're always going through continuous improvement. We're doing what we call a VFM refresh at this point in time, and it allows us to tailor projects, although we have a significant history in social infrastructure around hospitals. We also are growing our business around civil infrastructure, transit and highways. And so we have risk matrices and value for money assessments for each of those areas and for each specific project. If I could give you a few facts from our study of our 30 projects, and this gives a comparison of budgets that were set by the government, and we have to live within that budget, and the results that we've seen. So awarded contract amounts are 20% lower than the approved budgets. Awarded contract amounts are 5% lower than winning bids. Awarded contract amounts are 15.5% lower than average bids. And awarded contract amounts are 26% lower than highest bids. And so the competitive tension that we are seeing after we do our due diligence within a set budget means that we're getting better value for money, and it's saving taxpayers money.
All right, Dr. Blain, what do you say about what Dr. Semioteki said?
Well, I think I would say almost the same thing.
All right.
The one thing I could add is that you have in Canada 5 provinces that calculate value for money on all of their projects, and the methodologies in the different provinces are a little bit different. We're not all the same, but we all end up with similar conclusions. We're all still doing PPPs, and we all still are generating value for money. But there is no right answer to it, but they're all in the same ballpark.
I know that you have Canada has a national debt of only about a third of what we have per capita. How are most of these infrastructure projects financed? Is it more federal? Is it state, local? What kind of combination? How does it compare to what we do here in the U.S.?
Most capital projects are done at the provincial level or local government level. The province of British Columbia, if we do a project, it would typically be maybe half financed with private capital and half would be a grant from either the province or the federal government or from local government. And
well, that's my question. Is your federal government, your national government spending on infrastructure, is it comparable to the U.S. or?
Oh, I'm not sure the answer to that.
You don't know?
No. Do you?
I would say that, first off, that the provinces have been taking a lead in Canada on investing in infrastructure. I think that's a firm fact. I think relative to the U.S., we could do that assessment and provide that to you. Right. If I could offer one additional question or comment. The benefit of AFP, while we focus largely on investments that the provincial government is making in hospitals and courthouses and roads and transit systems, we are now seeing growing appetite from local governments, from municipalities. And so they have their own governance structure through municipal councils. They have to decide their policies. They have to decide how they're going to invest their dollars. And increasingly, the large municipalities are coming to Infrastructure Ontario asking for our input, asking for our advice, and asking us to be their procurement advisor on large transit projects. And so I would say that's a further validation that this is a growing trend and a positive way of delivering large projects that have a significant amount of risk.
Dr. Simiotiki, Dr. Blain says that when a private partner gets involved, that there's much more analysis and study and expert financing and so forth paid to the project, and that leads to savings in the end. What do you say about that? That when the government does it under traditional government methods?
I think the key benefit that the public-private partnership model has brought forward is due diligence up front. And the question that I would ask is, why are we not applying that to all of our projects? Why are we having agencies whose role is only to do that on PPP projects? In Canada, the vast majority of projects, even though the high-profile ones may be public-private partnerships, the vast majority are being done as traditional build projects. I think we could be applying many of the same learnings from these folks and from their agencies and organizations to traditional build projects. The question about risk is really at the core of this, and I think a question in that realm is, could we manage risks rather than transfer them if we have these skilled folks on the government side of the table, if we have the experts who have private sector experience in-house with government? Could we be applying models that manage those risks and use their expertise, use their due diligence, so that we don't pay the very high cost of risk transfer that we're paying at the moment?
I need to go to Mr. Capiano, but just one more thing. Mr. George, you say in your testimony that the World Bank has identified almost 5,000 3P projects since 1984, and there have been 700 in the United Kingdom since the mid-90s. And you say here that governments like Australia, Canada, Chile, Spain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Mexico, and the United Kingdom have all embraced the concept. Are any developed nations moving in the opposite direction? They've tried. You studied these all over the world. Is there any country that's gone into public-private partnerships and decided that they weren't good deals and they're going in the opposite direction?
I can't think of one where somebody is moving completely in the opposite direction. These have been challenged. Even in Canada and Ontario, they were challenged, but they basically reformed the system and came up with a proposal that kept PPPs, a core portion of PPPs, in place, but they made changes to make the public happier with the process. The same thing is happening right now in the UK with the PFI initiative. It has happened, where they've challenged that because there have been problems with some financings. I think the key here is if you think project by project, you can be right on the value for money, you could be right or wrong on the value for money or the risk premium. If you think programmatically, this adds a level of tension to the point that the professor made, that actually makes sure that government goes back. The same agencies that are doing PPPs are doing traditional procurement. Why are they doing them differently? And if you can change that, I think you can make government better, but I think keeping PPPs to keep that tension or that creative tension is probably a good idea.
Well, do you, most countries have gone in the direction of PPPs because they just felt like they couldn't come up with enough money to do things under the traditional way. Yet Dr. Simitecki says that it provides no new money. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree. It allows you to use your existing resources more efficiently.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Capiano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel. I particularly want to thank my 3 Canadian friends. Boston has a long tradition of friendship with Canada, mostly the Maritimes. But I particularly want to thank the gentleman from Ontario for Bobby Orr. It was probably the greatest natural resource you ever sent us, and we will be forever grateful. I will tell you that I continue, my frustration on one aspect of this whole discussion has been growing, and that's what is the definition of a P3. Now, honestly, when I agreed to do this panel, I didn't think of it as design build. I think of design build, I know it is now, but that's not what I thought P3s were. That's a separate category. So to a certain extent, I want to take design build off the table for the discussion because I look at it as different. And by the way, I always like to remind people how we got to so-called traditional financing. I don't know the history in Canada. I do know in the United States. We got there over generations of corruption. Generations of corruption where politicians and builders and designers ended up in jail because they colluded to steal taxpayer dollars, and we ended up with a system that was convoluted for the pure intention of making it more difficult. And now we're trying to tone that back a little bit. So, and I think that's a fair thing. Absent the design build, which I do agree that if it works well, on time and on budget is better with design build. I think everybody accepts that as a fact. I will tell you that the other thing I'm growing more and more frustrated with the complete lack of transparency on numbers. Every panel that has been here, I have asked for statistics to show me. Because to me, it is twofold. I actually do think we're here because we don't have the courage to provide the funding we need to provide. But at the same time, even if we had all the money in the world to do it, I still want it used in the most efficient manner. So this doesn't mean that P3s should be off the table. It means, okay, funding is a reason. And to be honest, let's be serious. That's why we're here, because we don't have the courage to do the funding mechanism. But nonetheless, we still should have this discussion. So on the efficiency stuff, it's hard to do efficiency without numbers. And Mr. Simitecki, you're the first one that I've seen with actual numbers on it. And I've been told it's because Ontario actually provides these numbers in a public way, yet nobody else does. Is my understanding correct?
Generally, yes. Partnerships BC provides some of these numbers. I work at the University of Toronto, so I'm closer to the Ontario case. But Partnerships BC has some of these numbers. Keep in mind, these are only the summary numbers, and I couldn't get the numbers behind those to really get at that.
I will tell you that as a member of the United States Congress, I'm having the exact same problem, getting numbers in. I'm a numbers guy. I mean, all the philosophy in the world, it's great on the campaign trail, but when it comes to this kind of stuff, nobody's going to elect me or unelect me because I embrace P3s. They're going to elect me or unelect me if I want to use their money efficiently, and I can't make that judgment without fair numbers. And I will tell you that the risk premium of 49% that you came up with, that's a number that you worked backwards to find. Am I correct on that? Mr. George, in your world, if someone were to say, forget everything else, what do you think the risk premium is on a non-design build P3? Would you put a 49% number if you just came up with it, or would you put a lower number, a higher number?
I wouldn't know how to come up with a number.
So it's flexible. It's unknowable. And that's the thing that gets me, is that depending on how you measure these things, I guess, Mr. George, for you, when you came up with your numbers, some of the things I have found them not to include is the numbers I've seen don't include the cost of diverted traffic when you do a highway. How much does it cost when you move traffic from this road to that road and you don't maintain the new road that they're doing, or you lose tolls? Did the cost of diverted traffic come up in your analysis?
We do credit ratings, so we are not looking at those things. But I would agree with you that we are not looking at the entire cost to the system.
Fair enough. And again, I don't know the Canadian tax system. In the United States, when we do a real P3 and we move it off, there are massive tax benefits to the investors. They get to write it off, and it comes directly out of the federal treasury, not the state treasury. I don't know how Canada works. Does it work the same way? In that, number one, investors get to write off, and if so, does that money come out of the province treasury, or does it come out of the federal, the national treasury?
Most places that are doing PPPs, they'll make an adjustment for tax transfers. It's called competitive neutrality, and we do make an adjustment for it. It's hard to estimate exactly because the money goes from the investors to the federal government to the provinces and goes around in a circle, and you have to try to calculate it, but we do.
But the money comes out of the national treasury. The tax credit is applied to a national tax as opposed to a province tax?
We take into account all the taxes. Like the provincial tax, of course, stays in the province.
But the bulk, again, I'm trying to analogize with the United States. You get a credit everywhere, but the bulk of the money comes out of the net because our federal taxes are higher than our state taxes or local taxes.
Fair enough.
Is that the same case in Canada? I'm asking because I don't know.
They're about the same. Yeah.
So I think a helpful study to look at may be the recent Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships analysis, which looked at the economic benefits, and it actually calculated some of the provincial or state and federal tax revenues as a result of public-private partnerships, also quantified income that is generated from these projects. And so,
see, part of the problem I have is that when they do it, I don't mind doing it. It's fine. Tax credits are fair. But it's an unaccounted item directly out of the federal treasury that basically takes money out of the federal government, namely the Highway Trust Fund or whoever else it comes from, and puts it into the hands of private companies that goes to a certain state that might find these things, as opposed to allowing us, the U.S. Congress, making a national policy as to what we think is appropriate to do. And I don't mind. I'm a former mayor. And to be perfectly honest, if I could find a way to put my hand in the pocket of the federal government, I would have done it. So I don't blame anybody for doing it, but now I'm on the federal side, and I don't like people reaching in our pocket unless we know it and approve it. And I think that's what's happening at the moment.
I think if I could add,
of course.
I think your initial question is, how do you define a public-private partnership is connected to the governance and whether or not it is on-book versus off-book, and accordingly the tax treatment. And this is an area where I think there are probably a number of fairly material differences between Canada and the U.S.
Right. And honestly, I've been spending more and more of my time trying to figure out where these P3s work best and where they don't. I actually kind of accept the fact that they might work best on complex, unique situations like a water situation, as opposed to a road, which doesn't take a whole lot of maintenance after the fact. Takes some maintenance, I get that. It's not the same kind of maintenance as a machine, a big, huge machine generating water, power, or whatever it might be. So I kind of accept that. But I got to tell you, I'm getting more and more skeptical because of the lack of information. And I understand exactly what you said, Mr. Blain, about the need to keep these numbers private. I get that. But it makes my job almost impossible when everybody's saying that. To actually make a legitimate judgment. It forces me back into my philosophical corner, which I'm trying to get out of. And I would like everyone to get out of because, let's be serious, I mean, we can pound our chest all day. Like I said, I'm not going to get elected or unelected on the basis of this issue. I'm just trying to find out what is right, and if so, what's right in what category. And without numbers, I can't do it. I mean, I can't do it honestly. I'm back into my philosophy corner, and that's really, we do that enough around here, and I'm trying to find a way to not do that.
If I could just one point on that, and what we did, and I don't know if you have the ability to do it here, is that the auditor to the province of British Columbia, which is a government auditor, audited our analysis. So our politicians got some comfort from the fact that the analysis was audited by...
And I appreciate that, but that still doesn't tell me what the auditors have taken into account. I mean, and again, it doesn't necessarily work there, but it's worked particularly in Chicago and Illinois and Indiana. How many cars were taking off the Indiana toll road and put onto separate roads? No one will tell me. I'm not even sure they've asked. And what was the cost of maintaining those roads? And how much they pay in tolls before? How much they pay in tolls now? No one will tell us. And to be perfectly honest, when people play hide the pea on me, I kind of walk away. It's like, okay, hide the pea all you want. I'm not playing. I know what works, and I'm willing to take these risks, particularly in design build, and I'm willing to do this. But if people aren't going to share detailed information with me to make my own analysis, including audits, but I want to see the government's audit, I want to see Fitch's audit, I want to see independent auditors, I want to see neutral auditors, and I balance them all together, that's how you make policy. And I'm not capable of doing that with the whole P3 concept now because everybody's sitting here with numbers. And I understand why, but I'm getting a little frustrated and way over my time. I apologize to the chairman and appreciate his indulgence.
All right. Mr. Barletta.
Thank you. Dr. Blain, you mentioned that in Canada the project is accounted for on the government's books. And one of the problems that we face, particularly in regards to using P3s for social infrastructure, is the upfront scoring issues here. How does Canada account for performance-based infrastructure projects?
It basically would be the present value of the payments over 30 years. So if we assume that the owner, the government, is going to make full payments, like there is a performing contract, and we're going to make full payments over 30 years, the present value of that becomes the liability of the province.
Mr. Morley?
So there are a number of things that we do. As I mentioned in my testimony, there's a long-term infrastructure policy that is in place. That translates to the provincial fiscal framework. And currently there's a piece of legislation before our legislature which would reinforce the idea of 10-year long-term infrastructure planning with automatic renewals every 5 years. And that's a way to ensure that we are planning the policy, assessing the evidence, and planning the fiscal impacts accordingly.
Thank you. If I could go back to finish my very first question, how do you structure these projects to see that the local subs can have an opportunity to participate in the bigger deals?
We don't go that far because our experience has been that the local contractors all get involved anyways. There's so much subcontracting, literally hundreds of subcontracts from a very large concession agreement that there's lots of business that is given out locally. The one thing we do require is that when the major concessionaires are responding to the request for qualifications, that they have to show us that they understand the local market, that they understand British Columbia and what's here, and so we do evaluate them on that. And then the next step is once we start a process, we have major business sessions where everybody comes and meets each other and they talk to each other and they speed dating and everything.
Mr. Morley?
I can add to that. There's a number of things that we're doing to try to encourage partnerships. First and foremost, we feel that we're a partnership organization. And so the first thing is on some projects, the partnerships happen naturally, where if they are in different parts of the province, a project lead will automatically engage more local contractors. At the same time, we've had some larger projects that are concentrated in urban centers, particularly urban transit projects, where through our RFQ and RFP processes, we have given the opportunity or created an incentive for the bidders to actually engage with local providers who will have local knowledge, local experience, and that we feel translates into better projects. Another aspect is that there are obviously important skill trades that are involved in all of these projects. Building that capacity is critical, and so involving apprentices in projects is increasingly important to us so that we have the labor force. And lastly, there are often job fairs that will translate into local jobs for local companies.
Dr. Simiatiki?
Yeah. The local industry, I'll speak only for Ontario, the local industry has been concerned about the place of public-private partnerships and what it's doing to local firms and local jobs. Over the summer, they started making noises in the media about bundling and projects becoming too large for many of these firms to become involved in. We heard it also from the Architects Association in Ontario. All of these concerns about the scale of the projects getting bigger. So no one's saying don't build infrastructure. These are industries that make a living off infrastructure, but they are saying they're feeling concerns about whether they're able to access these types of concessions. So it doesn't mean these issues aren't resolvable, but again, the data isn't there to really evaluate and step back and say, is this actually happening? To what extent are you being excluded? How much of a change is there between traditional and PPP? We're not able to get that data to really create those assessments. That's the type of work that I've been trying to carry out as an academic, to provide evidence that can then be used to set policy and come up with solutions if there really is a problem.
Mr. George,
I think the issue you have is that there is a need, with these large projects, there's a need for a large, creditworthy counterparty to wrap the risk. That, by definition, rules out some of these smaller subcontractors. Now, they can play at the level underneath the contractor, so that's an issue. But what I think you can look at is smaller projects that where they can, in fact, play, but those are not best suited for PPPs. The question is if one can create a center for excellence which actually can help these smaller projects be developed with some of the same discipline of a PPP, but be done without necessarily the private sector involvement that the way it's done on a PPP. So you can get the best of both worlds.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to put in the record, because I was raising the issue of revenues, and there's some who think somehow this is a free lunch program, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the federal gas tax in Canada is 40 cents a gallon, imperial gallon, so what's that, 37 here. The total tax in Vancouver, BC is $1.55 a gallon, Victoria $1.33 a gallon. That is part of the issue here. They are making an effort to maintain and build their transportation infrastructure. Their taxes are phenomenally higher than ours in the U.S. Ours hasn't been adjusted since 1993 at 18.4 cents. Dr. Blain, you mentioned that these are best used for greenfields, and then you talked about a half public, half private example.
Yes.
Does that apply to surface transportation without a toll? And if so, how does that private half get repaid?
It could be applied to an availability type of transportation project.
So
yes.
The government would pay the private person back on an annual basis. So essentially, you're booting it out into the future with some sort of a revenue stream. You're paying back their half plus 11%.
And the government could put in their half just as an upfront grant, or perhaps it could go in at the end of construction. It can go in at some point.
Right. But again, these are greenfields. We're not talking about maintenance, repair kind of things here.
The greenfield project includes the construction, the design.
No, I'm talking about we have a totally deteriorated 20th century infrastructure in this country.
Right.
We have, over $1 trillion of deferred maintenance. That's not really what we're talking about here.
That's not what we've done, no.
No, okay. And then, here's an example for Ontario. We just built a new courthouse in Eugene, Oregon. It came in on budget. $89 million. A little bit extravagant, in my opinion, but anyway, hey. You built a courthouse for $351 million that could have been built for $255. What's the risk in building a courthouse if you have a good contractor, you have a good design, and you come in on budget? Why would you paid 37% more? That would have meant here in America, if we adopted this model and we imputed some risk that didn't exist because we had a contract that came in on time, on budget, we would have paid another $40 million for it.
So I think we could definitely talk about specific examples. I think in general.
No, but let's talk about the courthouse. What's the huge risk that we're shifting, that needed to be shifted to pay a huge premium?
So I would probably not agree with the idea of a huge premium. I think a number of things that we've done around our courthouse projects have been quite positive. We've actually.
Oh, we have ours is winning international awards. It's very positive. The point is, we had a design. In this case, it wasn't design build. We bid it out competitively to the private sector. We got a good price. They came in and they met the contract. So we didn't add in some huge risk premium. Why would we want to add in a risk premium for something as simple as building a courthouse?
Well, I would say congratulations. That's an excellent project. What we found is that there's been concerns in doing these projects, particularly because we have also been consolidating courthouses from different regional areas to create more efficiencies, to save on life cycle costs over the lifetime of the
Right.
assets.
Well, unfortunately, thank you. But okay. But I mean, the bottom line is, and I just go back to Dr. Simuteki. I mean, what do you think about the courthouse example? I'm just trying to understand why I would want to do that. Why I would want to impute risk and pay more to someone to do it that way.
I think that's an ideal example of if you can manage risk, it's a lot cheaper than transferring it. And it doesn't mean that every example and every experience will be as good as yours, and we know that projects do often go over budget. But if you have the skills to manage them and you use the best contracting approaches, you will be getting cheaper infrastructure. Public-private partnerships are not a cheap way to deliver infrastructure. And so what I've been advocating is come up with better ways to manage those risks. Use ways that don't require expensive private financing, expensive transaction costs, expensive risk premiums built into those agreements. And if you look at my paper, the Auditor General of Ontario, for an earlier hospital program, commented that they thought 13% risk premium was too high. They said that the Peterborough Regional Centre, a hospital built under a traditional procurement approach during the same period, were built for about 5% of the total contract value. So it's the same issue that you're raising, that if we can get that for lower cost and we can actually deliver what we say, there is savings to be had there. Public-private partnerships are not cheap. They give you certainty, but you pay for it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Any more questions?
First of all, I'd like to thank all the panel today. It was very interesting, and we appreciate your time and your insight. With that, the meeting is adjourned.